The last thing my grandfather ever said to me was, "Don't let them bury what I built." I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was just an old man talking, the way people do near the end, when the words stop making full sense but the feeling behind them is more real than anything. I held his hand and nodded and told him I wouldn't. I thought I was just comforting him. I had no idea he was giving me instructions. That was March. By June, I was standing in the parking lot of the building I'd worked in for 4 years, holding a cardboard box with my stapler, my water bottle, and the framed photo of him and me ice fishing on Georgian Bay when I was 9. My brother had just walked me out personally, not security. My brother, he wanted me to see his face when it happened. "It's a business decision," he said, like that explained anything. Like those 3 words were supposed to land softly. I looked at him standing there in the doorway of the building my grandfather had started with $40,000 and a second mortgage on his house in Barrie, and I thought, "You rehearsed that line." "A business decision," I said back to him. "You've been undermining the direction of the company for 2 years, Owen." He didn't even flinch. "The board agrees." The board. Our uncle sat on that board. 2 of my brother's university friends sat on that board. I'd raised concerns about a land acquisition deal that smelled wrong. Inflated appraisals, a numbered company none of us could fully trace. And instead of anyone looking into it, I became the problem. I didn't say any of that in the parking lot. There was nothing left to say. I put the box in my truck, and I drove north on the 400, and I didn't turn the radio on for the first hour. My grandfather, Pop as I called him, had built Callaway Home Fabrications from nothing. He was the son of a Finnish immigrant who came to Ontario in the 1950s with $300 in a trade. Pop learned carpentry from his father, learned business from watching people make mistakes, and by the time he was 40, he had a mid-sized company doing custom millwork and cabinetry for residential builds across central Ontario. It wasn't glamorous. It was real. He employed 62 people at its peak, and he knew most of their kids by name. He died in March and left the company to his 2 grandsons equally, my brother Garrett and me. That was the will. That was what he wanted. What he didn't anticipate, or maybe what he understood better than any of us, was that Garrett had spent the last decade making friends with the right people and the right lawyers, and that equal shares on paper doesn't always mean equal power in practice. Within 8 weeks of the funeral, I was out. The one thing Pop left specifically to me, not to the estate, not split between us, just to me, was the property up near Tobermory. 40 acres on the edge of the Bruce Peninsula, with a small boathouse on the water and an old workshop that had been in our family since the 70s. Pop had stopped going up there in his last few years when the drive became too much. Garrett had never cared about it. It was remote, the road in was rough, and the buildings hadn't been touched in close to 15 years. My uncle, when the will was read, actually laughed a little. "He left you the swamp shack," he said to me, not even trying to be quiet. I drove up there on a Tuesday in late June with a sleeping bag, a case of Sleeman's, and about $1,200 in my checking account. I had no plan. I just didn't know where else to go. The road in was worse than I remembered. 2 kilometers of gravel that had turned into something closer to a creek bed. Ruts deep enough to swallow the front tire of my F-150, washouts where the spring runoff had just taken chunks of road with it. I got stuck twice. The second time I had to get out and dig with a piece of scrap lumber I found in the ditch. When I finally got through the tree line and saw the property, I sat in the truck for a long time without getting out. It looked like something that had given up. The workshop roof had partially collapsed on the west side. Not completely, but enough that you could see daylight through it from the outside. The boathouse was listing slightly toward the water. One of the main support posts rotted below the waterline. The dock was gone entirely, just a few rusted bolts sticking up from the rock where it used to be attached. Birch trees had grown up close on 3 sides, their roots probably into the foundation by now. A family of raccoons had clearly been living in the workshop. I could smell it before I opened the door. I stood in the middle of what used to be Pop's main workspace, where he'd built furniture in the summers, repaired engines, Did the kind of quiet tinkering that men of his generation did without making it a whole personality. And I looked at the workbench along the back wall, still standing, still solid, with his tools hung on pegboard above it exactly where he'd left them. A hand plane, a set of chisels, a marking gauge he'd had since before my father was born. Everything else was chaos. But that bench was perfect. I opened a beer and sat on an overturned bucket and thought, okay, what do I actually know how to do? The answer, it turned out, was more than I'd given myself credit for. I'd grown up in this family. I'd spent summers with Pop. I knew how to frame a wall, read a joist, swing a hammer without making a mess of everything. I wasn't a contractor, but I wasn't useless either. And I had time. I had nothing but time. I went back to Owen Sound the next morning and spent $400 at the Habitat for Humanity restore. Salvaged lumber, a box of assorted hardware, 2 doors that were close enough to the right size, a used dehumidifier that I needed more than almost anything else. The woman at the counter helped me load it all into the truck bed and wished me luck. I told her I needed it. The roof took me 3 weeks. I watched videos at the library in Wyerton because the cellular signal on the property was basically decorative. I'd drive the 40 minutes in, sit at a table by the window, take notes in an actual notebook like it was 1987, and drive back. A retired tradesman named. I called him the hardware guy because he was at the building supply in Lion's Head almost every time I was there. Eventually just started answering my questions directly. He'd look at my phone photos, tell me what I was doing wrong, and send me back. He never asked why I was doing this alone. I think he could see it on me. The structural work on the boathouse was scarier than the roof. The main post replacement required me to temporarily support the whole southwest corner with a cribbing system I assembled from salvaged 6x6s, a hydraulic jack from the back of my truck, and a prayer to my grandfather's memory. When it held and I got the new post set, I actually sat down on the dock rock and breathed for about 5 minutes straight. I was sleeping in the workshop by then, in the one corner that was dry. I'd hung a tarp for privacy from nothing in particular, set up a camp stove, kept a cooler. It was August, and the nights were warm enough that it didn't matter. I'd fall asleep hearing the water and wake up to loons. Honestly, some part of me, the part that had spent 4 years in boardrooms arguing about profit margins, was almost okay. I didn't talk to my brother. I didn't talk to my uncle. My mother called twice. I called her back once and kept it short. She'd sided with Garrett in the estate mess, or at least hadn't unsided with him, and there was a conversation we'd need to have eventually that I wasn't ready for yet. It was the last week of August when I started on the interior of the workshop. The plan was simple: clear out the damage, shore up what could be saved, make it actually livable enough that I could get through a winter if I needed to. I wasn't thinking past that. I worked from the north wall south, pulling out the ruined insulation, checking the framing behind it, replacing what needed replacing. The east wall was fine. The south wall, which backed onto the shoreline side, needed new sheathing in 2 places. The west wall, the one under the collapsed section of roof, was where I expected to find the worst of it. What I found instead made me stop completely. The framing on the west wall was intact, which surprised me, given the roof damage. But as I was pulling back the old vapor barrier, I noticed something that didn't add up. The wall cavity was only about 8 inches deep where I was working, normal for the framing. But when I moved to the north end of the west wall, near the corner, and knocked on the drywall, the sound changed. Not the dead thud of insulation behind it. Something hollow, something with more space behind it. I knocked again. Then I measured. From the outside, I knew the west wall was a certain length. From the inside, measuring the north corner, I was coming up short, by almost 3 feet. 3 feet that wasn't accounted for by the thickness of any wall I'd seen. I stood there with my tape measure and looked at that corner for a long time. Don't let them bury what I built. I got the pry bar. The drywall came off in pieces. Behind it was a second layer, older, the kind of gypsum board they used in the 70s, painted a pale yellow that had gone the color of old teeth. I worked carefully. I didn't know what I was looking at, and I didn't want to damage whatever was on the other side. When I got through, I found a space roughly 3 feet wide and floor-to-ceiling tall, framed in the same lumber as the rest of the building, but clearly enclosed intentionally. Not a mistake. Not a void left by some structural quirk. Someone had built this. Inside the space were three things. The first was a flat file cabinet, the kind architects and engineers use, wide and low, with shallow drawers. It was pushed flat against the back of the cavity, and it was padlocked. Old padlock, the kind with a long shackle but solid. The second was a wooden crate, the kind used for shipping fragile equipment, with Pop's handwriting on the lid in black marker. Personal, do not discac. I had to breathe through my nose for a minute when I saw his handwriting. The third was a Manitoba maple branch that had somehow grown through a gap in the exterior sheathing and curled around inside the cavity like it was making itself at home. I respected the dedication but had to cut it back. The padlock on the flat file came off with bolt cutters. I drove to Lion's Head for them, couldn't focus the whole way there and back. Inside the cabinet were 8 drawers. The first 3 held rolled architectural drawings, the original plans for the workshop, the boathouse, and what looked like an early version of the main yard layout back at the Barry shop. Old drawings, careful, done by hand. The 4th drawer held a folder thick with correspondence, letters, mostly going back decades, some handwritten and some typed. I didn't read them all that night. There were too many. The 5th drawer was the one that changed everything. Inside it was a legal-size envelope, unsealed, with my name on the front in Pop's handwriting. Not Garrett's name. Not the estate. Mine, Owen. I sat down on the workshop floor, on the bare plywood with sawdust in my hair and grease on my hands, and I opened it. Inside the envelope were 2 documents and a handwritten letter. The letter was 3 pages, front and back, written in Pop's small, precise hand. I won't recount all of it here. Some of it was personal, things he wanted to say to me that were between him and me and the walls of that workshop. But the part that matters for everything that came after was this. He had known, or strongly suspected, that the land acquisition deal I'd raised concerns about was corrupt. He'd been watching it develop for over a year before he died. He hadn't gone to the board because he no longer trusted the board. He hadn't told me because he didn't want to put me in a position where I was acting on his information rather than my own judgment. But he had documented everything he knew. The first document was a signed statutory declaration, witnessed by a lawyer in Barry, stamped, dated 2 months before he died, laying out in clear language what he believed was happening. The inflated appraisals, the numbered company, the connection to a real estate developer my uncle had a personal relationship with that had never been disclosed to the other board members. His belief that company funds had been directed toward the acquisition, specifically to benefit my uncle and the developer with my brother's knowledge and consent. The second document was a transfer of his shares in the company, not to the estate, not to be split. A direct transfer, executed while he was still alive and mentally competent, signed and witnessed, transferring his 20% stake to me personally, effective upon his death. I read that second document 4 times. Then I called the only lawyer I knew personally, a woman I'd gone to university with who now practiced in Guelph, and I took a photo of it and sent it to her. It was 11 o'clock at night. She called me back in 20 minutes. "Owen," she said, "is this real?" "I found it in a hidden wall cavity in my grandfather's workshop," I said. There was a pause. "Okay," she said. "Don't show this to anyone else yet. Don't tell your brother. Can you get here by Thursday?" The next 6 weeks were the strangest of my life. I kept going back to the property. I kept working. Finished the west wall, rehung the interior, started on the boathouse doors. I needed something to do with my hands while the legal process moved at its own pace. The work kept me from sitting still and thinking about what was coming. My lawyer. I'll call her my lawyer because that's what she became, coordinated with a securities lawyer in Toronto who specialized in corporate governance. What Pop had documented, combined with records they were able to subpoena once the statutory declaration was filed with the court, painted a clear picture. The numbered company connected to my uncle held an interest in the property being acquired. The appraisals had been conducted by a firm with ties to the same developer. The board minutes my brother had submitted to regulators omitted 2 meetings where concerns had been raised verbally. Meetings that, thanks to Pop's obsessive note-keeping, had been documented in the letters in the flat file drawer. My brother called me in October. It was the first time we'd spoken since June. "I don't know what you think you found," he said, "but you need to understand what you're doing to this family." I was standing outside on the rock by the water. The bay had gone gray and cold, and there were whitecaps further out. I watched them while he talked. "What I'm doing to this family," I said when he was done. "This is going to destroy everything Pop built." I thought about that for a second. I thought about the workbench, still perfect while everything else rotted. I thought about his handwriting on the crate. I thought about him in the hospital in March, holding my hand, telling me not to let them bury what he built. "No," I said. "What you did was going to destroy it. I'm just not letting that happen." He didn't have a response to that. We stayed on the line for a moment, just the sound of the wind and the water between us, and then I hung up. The regulatory investigation took several months. I'm not going to go through all of it in detail, because honestly, it was mostly emails and conference calls and documents I had to sign and scan and send, and none of it felt real while it was happening. What I can tell you is that my uncle resigned from the board in November. My brother's legal exposure was significant enough that a restructured ownership arrangement was negotiated. He retained an operational role at reduced compensation under the oversight of a reconstituted board. But his equity position was substantially diluted. The undisclosed interest in the acquisition deal was unwound. 2 of my brother's board allies stepped down. The company didn't collapse. That was the thing I'd been most afraid of. That pulling on this thread would bring the whole thing down, and 60-some employees would lose their jobs because of what had been done above their heads. It didn't. The business itself was healthy. The corruption had been at the ownership level, not in the operations. I went back to the property in November, after the first real snow. I parked at the edge of the tree line and looked at what I'd done over the summer and fall. The workshop roof was solid, not a sag in it. The boathouse was level, the new post holding. I'd rebuilt the dock in September, simple, pressure-treated, nothing fancy, but it went out 20 feet over good water and it wasn't going anywhere. I'd put in new windows on the south side of the workshop, double pane, and in the afternoon light they caught the sun coming off the bay and threw it back warm and gold across the floor. I went inside and stood at Pop's workbench. His tools were still on the pegboard where he'd hung them. I hadn't moved a single one. I'd been offered my position back at the company. The new board chair, a woman brought in from outside, someone none of us knew personally, which was specifically the point, had called me directly. I told her I'd think about it. I was still thinking. What I knew was this. I'd come up here with $1,200 in a sleeping bag, and I'd fixed something that everyone else had decided wasn't worth fixing. I'd done it myself, a bit at a time, with library videos and a retired hardware guy and about 4 months of early mornings and sore hands. And inside a wall that no one else had thought to look behind, my grandfather had left me everything I needed. Not the money, not the legal documents, though those mattered. The thing he'd actually left me was the proof that he had known me, that of everyone who had a claim on his life's work. He had looked at me and thought, that one won't let it go. The flat file cabinet is in the workshop now, cleaned up, the drawers running smooth. I kept the architectural drawings in it. I kept the letters. The legal documents are in a fireproof safe I bought in Owen Sound. The crate, the one with his handwriting on the lid, I left sealed for a long time. I finally opened it in December on a Sunday afternoon with snow coming down outside. Inside was a set of hand tools he'd bought at an estate sale in the late 1960s, before my father was born. Japanese woodworking chisels, their blades still keen under 50 years of careful storage, a hand saw, a marking knife with a rosewood handle worn smooth by use. A note on top said, "These were made to last. So was this place. So are you." I set the chisels out on the workbench, side by side in order of size, and stood there for a while looking at them. Outside, the snow came down on the bay, and the birch trees stood white against the gray water, and the dock I had built stretched out over the surface of the lake, and everything was quiet, and everything held.